A canyon is not cut by a flood. It forms because a river has been running, quietly, for longer than any civilization ever named it, one grain of sediment carried away at a time. Somewhere else, at exactly human scale, a person is deciding for the third time this week whether to answer a message now or let it wait an hour. Neither choice looks like anything, both are cutting something. This is a list of decisions almost too small to notice while they are being made. One of them explains why walking through a doorway can erase the reason you walked into the room at all. Another explains why 5 kind words seem to be the quiet ratio a marriage actually runs on, and why losing that ratio cost more than any single argument ever could. A third is simple arithmetic. One number improved by a single percent, repeated daily, multiplies itself almost 40 times over within a year, while the same number allowed to slip by that same percent shrinks toward nearly nothing. None of these decisions announce themselves. That is the whole point of this list, and the whole reason a life can be quietly built or quietly spent without a single dramatic moment ever taking the credit or the blame. There is no need to rush any of this. Settle in. An hour or two, unhurried, is exactly the right amount of time to notice how small a decision usually is, right up until the moment it is not. Before his ship passed the coast of the Sirens, Odysseus did something almost no one in his position had reason to do. He ordered his own crew to bind him to the mast with rope, and told them in advance to ignore anything he said, or did once the singing started, no matter how desperately he begged to be freed. Homer's audience would have understood exactly what was happening. Odysseus knew the siren's song did not fail to work because a man's judgment was weak in some abstract sense. It failed because judgment itself would not survive contact with a temptation built specifically to unmake resolve. No argument summoned in the moment was going to hold against that song, so he did not trust the future version of himself with the decision at all. He made the decision early, while he still could, and handed the actual moment of temptation to people who were deaf to the song and immune to his pleading. The economist Thomas Schelling later gave this strategy a name in his writing on commitment: binding your own future choices before a moment arrives in which you know you cannot be trusted to choose well. It shows up everywhere once it has a name. A person locks savings into an account that penalizes early withdrawal, not because the penalty is pleasant, but because the penalty is the whole point. A person throws away the last cigarettes in the house, rather than simply resolving not to smoke them. A person hands their car keys to a friend before the first drink is poured, at the one moment they can still be trusted to make that decision. None of these acts require heroic willpower in the moment they matter most. They require something rarer and more reliable, a decision made early, by a version of a person still thinking clearly, on behalf of a version who will not be. Every ship that has ever passed a coast like that one has needed rope tied long before the singing started. You have probably had this happen. You stand up in one room, cross into another to get something specific, and arrive with no memory of what that something was, only a vague sense that a decision that felt certain a moment ago has simply gone. The psychologist Gabriel Radvansky and his colleagues studied this directly, and found that crossing through a doorway measurably increases the odds of exactly this kind of forgetting, even inside a virtual environment with no physical door at all, and nothing but a screen and a controller involved. They called it the location updating effect. Their explanation is that memory appears to be organized around distinct mental event models tied to the space a thought occurred in, rather than simply tied to time passing. Leaving a room seems to close the current mental file and open a new one for the next space, and whatever was filed under the old room becomes briefly harder to reach. Interestingly, walking back into the original room sometimes brings the forgotten thought back almost immediately, as if the file has simply been reopened. None of this means the decision was ever truly lost. A choice made in the kitchen about what to say later, or a plan formed at a desk about what to do next, is still sitting exactly where it was left. It has simply been filed under a room a person is no longer standing in, waiting to be reopened the next time that room is. The decision did not vanish, it only stayed behind, in a room already left. Take an ordinary number, improve it by exactly 1%, and do that again the next day, and the day after for a full year, and it does not grow by a year's worth of 1% simply added together. It grows to roughly 37 times its original size. The arithmetic is not a metaphor. 1 multiplied by 1.01, repeated 365 times, comes out close to 37.8. Run the same number backward, shrinking it by 1% every day instead, and it falls to roughly 3% of where it started, nearly nothing, over the exact same year. The two numbers begin only 0.02 apart on day 1. For the first week they are almost impossible to tell apart. It is only much later, once the compounding has had months to work, that the gap between them becomes visible to anyone watching from the outside. This is the part that trips people up. The mind is built to notice addition, not multiplication, so this decision that improves something by 1% feels like a rounding error, too small to matter, easy to skip on a tired day. But the ordinary choices that make up a week, what gets eaten, what gets read, what gets practiced, what gets said, are rarely one-time events. They repeat daily in either direction, and the honest math behind that repetition does not round anything down. By the time the difference is visible to anyone, it has already been compounding for months. Give a person an ordinary ceramic mug, ask what they would sell it for, and then ask a different person with no mug what they would pay for the identical one, and the two numbers will not agree. The owner typically asks for close to twice as much as the buyer offers. Economists Richard Thaler, Daniel Kahneman, and Jack Netsch ran versions of this experiment repeatedly and called the pattern the endowment effect. The moment an object becomes yours, its value in your own mind rises, not because anything about the mug has changed, but because ownership itself does quiet, invisible work on the price a person is willing to accept for parting with it. The effect holds up even when the mug was handed over only minutes earlier, with no history, no memory, no sentiment attached to it at all. The same markup applies well beyond mugs. An opinion once stated out loud becomes harder to abandon than it would have been to never state at all. A plan once committed to gets defended past the point where the original reasons for it still apply. A routine, once adopted, starts to feel like a possession worth protecting rather than a choice that remains open to revision. In each case, letting go registers as a loss, and losses are treated by the mind as heavier than they actually are. The mug was never worth two different amounts, only the ownership was. Offer a person a coin flip where heads wins a sum of money and tails costs the same sum, and most people will refuse the bet outright, even though the odds are perfectly even and the expected outcome is exactly zero either way. This is the finding at the center of the research that helped earn Daniel Kahneman a Nobel Prize in economics. Kahneman and his collaborator Amos Tversky called it loss aversion. Losing a given amount hurts roughly twice as much as gaining the same amount pleases. The mind does not weigh a potential loss and an equivalent potential gain on the same scale. It puts a thumb firmly on the side of the loss. This lopsided scale likely served a useful purpose once, when a wrong step could mean real danger and a cautious animal outlived a bold one. It serves less useful purposes now, in decisions that carry no real danger at all. A person stays in a job that no longer fits because leaving reads as losing something certain in exchange for something merely possible. A person keeps a subscription, a habit, a familiar arrangement, not because it still serves them, but because ending it feels like the heavier side of a bet that, on the actual numbers, is not close. The choice was never between a loss and a gain of equal size. It only ever felt that way. Spin a wheel rigged to land on either a low number or a high number, then ask a person, moments later, to estimate something entirely unrelated, and their answer drifts toward whichever number the wheel happened to land on. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran exactly this experiment, asking people to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations after watching a rigged wheel land on either 10 or 65. People who saw the low number guessed low. People who saw the high number guessed high, despite the wheel having nothing whatsoever to do with the question that followed it. They called the pattern anchoring. The mind grabs the first available number as a starting point and adjusts away from it, but not nearly far enough. The effect shows up constantly outside the laboratory. The first price mentioned in a negotiation quietly sets the range everyone else argues within, even when both sides know the number was chosen strategically rather than fairly. A listing price on a house shapes what a buyer is willing to offer, long before the buyer has independently assessed what the house is actually worth. A first salary figure named in an interview anchors every counteroffer that follows it, regardless of what the role is genuinely worth to either party. Even a menu can do it. A single extravagant dish placed at the top of the page, rarely ordered by anyone, quietly makes every other price on the same page look reasonable by comparison, simply by having been read first. The wheel had nothing to do with the question, the mind used it anyway. In some countries, a person becomes an organ donor automatically at adulthood unless they specifically choose not to be. In neighboring countries, with broadly similar populations, a person becomes a donor only if they specifically choose to be. The gap in donor consent rates between the two systems is enormous. Researchers Eric Johnson and Daniel Goldstein documented this pattern across several European nations in the early 2000s, and the explanation was not that people in one country cared more about donation than people in the other. The explanation was the default itself. Whatever option is already selected before a decision gets made requires no action to keep, while switching away from it requires a person to notice the choice exists, form an opinion about it, and act. 3 separate steps that a great many people simply never get around to. The same logic later shaped retirement savings policy, where automatically enrolling employees in a savings plan, with the option to opt out, produced far higher participation than asking employees to actively opt in ever did. Nobody in either system consciously decided that the default was right for them. Most people never examined it at all, which is precisely why it did so much of the deciding on their behalf. Nobody chose the default. That is exactly why it works. By the time it was clear the Concorde supersonic jet would never turn a profit, the British and French governments kept funding it anyway, for years, largely because of how much money had already gone into the project. Economists now call this pattern the sunk cost fallacy, and sometimes the Concorde fallacy in its honor. The money already spent was gone either way, recoverable through neither continuing nor cancelling the program, yet its sheer size kept exerting pressure on a decision that should only have been about what happened next. The same math runs quietly through much smaller decisions. A half-read book gets finished less because the remaining chapters promise anything, and more because of the chapters already behind it. A bad lease gets endured for its remaining months rather than exited early, even when exiting would cost less overall. A struggling project gets one more round of effort, not because the effort is likely to pay off, but because so much effort has already gone in. None of these decisions are actually choosing between the past and the future. They only feel that way because the past keeps showing up uninvited to argue for itself, long after it has stopped having any real vote in the matter. The money spent on the Concorde was gone either way. Only the decision about tomorrow was still real. Ask a person to put a price on a shelf they assembled themselves from a flat pack kit, and ask a different person to price the identical shelf, fully built and delivered ready to use, and the builder usually asks for more. Researchers Michael Norton, Daniel Motion, and Dan Ariely ran this experiment and named the pattern the IKEA effect. Labor itself, even small, imperfect, mildly frustrating labor, creates a sense of ownership and value that is disproportionate to the object's actual quality, sometimes even when the assembled version is visibly worse built than the professional one sitting right next to it. The effort spent becomes part of what is being valued, quietly folded into the price, without ever being named as a separate line item. The same folding happens well past furniture. A vacation planned meticulously by hand feels more valuable than an identical one, simply booked through a service, regardless of whether the outcome differs at all. A relationship a person has personally worked to repair gets defended more fiercely than its current condition alone would justify. A project someone has personally struggled through resists being abandoned. Long after abandoning it would be the more sensible decision, purely because so much of a person's own effort is already folded into it. The shelf was not more valuable because it was well built, it was more valuable because it was built by hand at all. Show a person the same abstract shape enough times, without ever telling them why they are seeing it, and they begin rating it as more pleasant than shapes they are seeing for the first time, even though they cannot recall having seen it before at all. The psychologist Robert Zajonc demonstrated this repeatedly in the late 1960s, and the finding has held up across decades of further research since, under the name the mere exposure effect. Familiarity itself, with no other information attached to it, functions as a signal. One reasonable explanation traces it back to a simple survival logic. Something unfamiliar might be dangerous, while something proven itself safe has effectively proven itself safe, regardless of what it actually is. This quiet preference for the familiar shapes far more ordinary decisions than people tend to credit it for. A brand seen often enough starts to feel trustworthy for no reason connected to its actual quality. A song heard repeatedly on the radio starts to feel like a favorite when the honest explanation is simply repetition. A political message, an argument, even a face, gains a kind of borrowed credibility purely from having been encountered often enough to stop registering as new. This is part of why a stranger met at a regular gathering week after week tends to feel more trustworthy than a stranger met once, at length, even when the two people have shared roughly the same total amount of conversation. Repetition, not depth, appears to be doing much of the work. Nothing about the shape had changed. Only the number of times it had been seen had. Ask someone how long a move, a renovation, or a big project will take, and their estimate is usually too optimistic, even when the same person is asked, right after finishing a nearly identical project that took far longer than they had guessed that time as well. Researchers Roger Buehler, Dale Griffin, and Michael Ross documented this pattern closely, calling it the planning fallacy, and one of its stranger features is that direct personal evidence does almost nothing to correct it. A person can have the actual past duration sitting in their own memory, available to consult, and still produce a fresh estimate that ignores it in favor of an optimistic best-case scenario for the plan currently in front of them. The explanation researchers favor is that people naturally focus on the specific steps of the plan they can currently see, rather than the base rate of how similar plans have actually gone in the past, including their own. The effect quietly reshapes decisions well past scheduling. A budget gets set around the optimistic version of a project rather than the likely one. A commitment gets made based on how a week is supposed to go rather than how weeks like it have actually tended to go. The plan itself, drawn early, decides much of what follows it. A calendar filled to the edge on the assumption that everything will run smoothly leaves no room for the ordinary friction that has, in fact, shown up in nearly every week that has ever been lived, and the resulting scramble gets experienced as bad luck rather than as a foreseeable outcome of the original estimate. The evidence was sitting in their own memory. The estimate ignored it anyway. Offer a person a smaller reward today or a larger reward in a month, and many choose the smaller one now. Offer the same two choices but push both dates a year into the future, keeping the same 1 month gap between them, and most people flip and choose the larger, later reward instead. Behavioral economists studying what is called present bias or hyperbolic discounting have found this reversal again and again. The near future gets discounted far more steeply in a person's mind than the distant future does, which means a reward arriving tomorrow gets treated almost like it belongs to someone else entirely, while the identical reward arriving a year and a month from now gets weighed far more fairly. The self that will actually receive tomorrow's reward ends up treated almost like a stranger. This is a large part of why saving, exercising, and starting difficult work all tend to fail in the same specific way, not through a single bad decision, but through a long series of small ones, each individually reasonable, each quietly discounting a future self who will eventually have to live with all of them at once. A dessert skipped next month, imagined calmly in advance, feels easy to commit to. The identical dessert, sitting on the table this evening, does not feel like the same decision at all, even though the only thing that has actually changed between the two moments is how close tomorrow has gotten. Debt works the same way in reverse. A payment due next year feels almost abstract at the moment a purchase is being made, and only becomes fully real once next year has quietly become this month. The math had not changed between the two choices, only how far away tomorrow felt had. Set up a tasting table offering 24 flavors of jam, and a different table nearby offering just 6, and more people stop to browse the larger display. Far more of them actually buy something from the smaller one. Psychologists Sheila Iyengar and Mark Lepper ran this experiment and used it to describe choice overload, the finding that past a certain point, additional options can lower the odds a decision gets made at all rather than raise them. Later researchers, attempting to replicate the effect across other products and settings, have found it smaller and less consistent than the original jam study suggested, and some studies find no overload effect whatsoever. What survives the debate is the underlying tension the original experiment pointed at. Wanting a wide range of options and being able to actually choose among them are not the same skill, and a display, a menu, or a set of retirement fund choices can be generous enough to attract attention while still being large enough to make walking away the easiest decision available. A streaming service with a handful of curated recommendations gets watched. The same service with an endless scrolling catalogue often gets closed with nothing chosen at all, the evening spent browsing rather than watching. The paradox is not that choice is bad, it is that a decision, at some point, still has to be made by someone standing in front of all those options, and a wide enough field can quietly relieve a person of ever having to make it. More choices had not made the decision easier, they had only made it easier to walk away from. asked two groups of patients to rate how painful a medical procedure was. After one group experiences a shorter procedure that ends sharply at its worst moment, and the other experiences a longer procedure of the same peak discomfort, but with a gentler final stretch. The longer procedure gets remembered as less painful overall. Daniel Kahneman, working with colleagues on studies of colonoscopy patients, named this pattern the peak end rule. Memory does not average an experience moment by moment the way a stopwatch would. It compresses the whole thing down to roughly 2 data points, the single most intense moment, and however things happen to end, and lets those 2 points stand in for everything else that happened in between. Duration, oddly, barely factors into the final memory at all. The implication reaches well past medical procedures. How a conversation ends shapes how the whole conversation gets remembered, regardless of how it went in the middle. How a visit, a meal, or a workday ends carries outsized weight in the story a person later tells themselves about it. A rough middle stretch, followed by even a small, deliberate improvement at the close, can leave a better memory behind than a smooth middle followed by an abrupt, unresolved ending ever would. A host who spends most of an evening distracted but walks each guest to the door with genuine warmth will often be remembered as a wonderful host. A host who is attentive for hours and then rushes everyone out at the end tends to be remembered, unfairly but reliably, as the second one. The middle of the experience mattered least of all to how it would be remembered. Study the same material in one long sitting, or spread the identical material across several shorter sittings days apart, and the spread version sticks in memory far longer, even though both versions took the same total amount of time. Hermann Ebbinghaus discovered the shape of this pattern testing his own memory in the 1880s, and more than a century of research since has confirmed what he found. Spaced repetition beats massed repetition for long-term retention, reliably and by a wide margin. What makes the finding stubborn in practice is that cramming does not feel worse while it is happening. Rereading familiar material produces a strong feeling of fluency, of things clicking easily into place, and that fluency gets mistaken for mastery. Spaced practice, by contrast, often feels harder in the moment, because some forgetting has genuinely occurred between sessions and has to be worked past again, which is precisely the friction that builds a stronger, more durable memory. The decision to cram, then, is rarely a decision to learn less on purpose. It is a decision to trust how learning feels over what learning actually does, made over and over by people who have never been shown the gap between the two. A student who rereads a chapter the night before an exam, and a student who studies the same chapter in 3 shorter passes across the preceding week will often report equal confidence walking in, and only one of them will still remember the material a month later, once the exam itself has stopped being the point. The feeling of learning and the fact of it turned out to be 2 different things entirely. Read someone a list of 20 ordinary words and ask them, a few minutes later, to recall as many as they can, and the words from the beginning and the end of the list come back easily. The words from the middle mostly do not. The pattern is called the serial position effect, and its 2 halves have separate explanations that researchers going back to Bennett Murdoch in the 1960s worked out carefully. The earliest words on a list get rehearsed silently, again and again, while later words are still arriving, which pushes them into longer-term memory ahead of everything else. The last few words are still sitting in short-term memory at the moment of recall, requiring no retrieval effort at all. The words in the middle get neither advantage. They arrive too late for the early rehearsal, and leave too early to still be sitting in short-term memory when the question comes. The same shape appears whenever anything gets arranged into an order. What gets said first in a meeting is remembered. What gets said last is remembered. The genuinely important point raised in the middle, with nothing protecting it on either side, quietly disappears along with everything else that shared its position. Nothing about the middle items was less important. They just arrived at the wrong point in the list. Benjamin Franklin once described winning over a rival legislator who had openly disliked him, not by doing the man a favor, but by asking to borrow a rare book from his library. The rival lent the book. According to Franklin's own account in his autobiography, the 2 men became friends soon afterward, and remained so for the rest of the rival's life. Franklin himself drew a small lesson from it. A person who has once done you a kindness is more inclined to do you another than a person you have been kind to yourself. 2 centuries later, psychologists John Jecker and David Landy tested the pattern directly and found it holds up under controlled conditions. People who are asked to do a small favor for someone tend to end up liking that person more afterward, not less, likely because the mind looks for a reason to explain its own effort and settles on the simplest one available. The recipient must be worth helping. The direction of a small request, then, is rarely neutral. Asking for help in the right small dose can build a connection that offering help never quite manages to build in the same way. He had not asked for the man's friendship. He had only asked for a book. Watch enough married couples argue, and a number starts to emerge. Couples heading toward long-term stability show roughly 5 warm or positive exchanges for every sharp or negative one. Couples heading toward separation show a ratio far closer to even. The psychologist John Gottman arrived at this figure across decades of research observing couples in detail, and one part of the finding surprises people every time it is explained to them. The ratio was never really about avoiding conflict. Stable couples in his research still argued, sometimes intensely. What separated them was everything surrounding the argument, the small warm exchanges scattered through an ordinary week that most people never think to count at all, a joke that lands, an eye roll held back rather than let loose, a compliment offered without being asked for. None of it feels significant in the moment it happens. Neither partner in a stable marriage sits down and calculates a ratio on purpose. The ratio simply accumulates, one small choice at a time, out of thousands of moments across a marriage where either warmth or its absence could have been chosen instead, and mostly was not consciously chosen at all. Neither partner was keeping score. The relationship was keeping it for them. Walk into almost any grocery store built in the last several decades, and the milk and eggs sit at the very back, and that placement was not an accident of construction. It was a decision, made once, by someone who understood exactly what a longer walk through a store accomplishes. Retail layouts are designed, deliberately and in detail, around this same principle in dozens of smaller ways. Everyday essentials get spread apart rather than grouped together, so that reaching any one of them requires passing rows of other products a shopper had no intention of buying when they walked in. Items placed at eye level sell better than identical items placed near the floor, so the most profitable products, rather than the most useful ones, tend to occupy that shelf. The aisle nearest the checkout is stocked with small, easily grabbed items, precisely because a person waiting in line has nothing else left to decide. None of these individual choices feel like they are being made for a shopper. Each one simply nudges the walk a little longer, the eye a little further, the wait a little more tempting, and the shopper experiences the sum of all of it as their own list, their own preferences, their own afternoon. The list in your hand felt like the whole decision. The floor plan had already made half of it. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius kept a private notebook, never intended for anyone else to read, that survives today as the Meditations, and much of it is simply him practicing, in writing, how to pause before responding to whoever had angered him that day. Centuries before modern psychology had a name for emotional regulation, the Stoic philosophers were already describing the same mechanism in careful detail. Epictetus taught that people are disturbed not by events themselves but by their own judgments about those events, a judgment that arrives in an instant but does not have to be acted on in the same instant. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire while writing to no one but himself, kept returning to the same practice, noticing the space that opens between an insult landing and a reply being chosen, and deliberately widening it even slightly before deciding what filled it. What fills that gap changes almost everything about the decision that follows it. A breath taken before answering, a reframing of the other person's motive before assuming the worst one, a single beat of delay, long enough for the sharpest possible reply to pass by unused. None of it removes the provocation. It only changes what gets built on top of it. The insult arrived in an instant. The reply Marcus Aurelius kept insisting to himself did not have to. In a paper published in 1984, the organizational psychologist Carl Weick argued that most large social problems are never solved directly. They are worn down, slowly, by small wins deliberately kept too modest for anyone to bother celebrating. Weick's reasoning ran against the instinct most people have when facing something big. Frame the problem honestly at its full size, and the size itself becomes the obstacle, triggering exactly the kind of stress and overwhelm that makes people freeze rather than begin. A properly small win, by contrast, keeps its own stakes low enough that a person can actually attempt it without much internal resistance, and finishing it produces a small amount of momentum, evidence, and confidence that makes the next small win slightly more likely to be attempted as well. Nothing about any single win looks impressive from the outside. The pattern only becomes visible looking backward, once a long chain of them has quietly accumulated into something that does look impressive. A life reorganized in one dramatic overhaul rarely holds for long because the overhaul itself was sized to impress rather than to survive an ordinary week. A decision small enough to feel unremarkable, chosen instead, is often the only kind that actually gets repeated. Nobody threw a party for it, which was exactly why it worked. In a series of experiments beginning in the 1960s, the psychologist Walter Mischel offered young children a single marshmallow now, or 2 marshmallows if they could wait alone in a room for several long minutes without eating the one already in front of them. The study became one of the most famous in psychology, largely because Mischel's early follow-ups suggested that children who waited longer went on to do somewhat better across a range of outcomes years later, which turned the marshmallow into popular shorthand for willpower predicting success in life. A 2018 reanalysis by Tyler Watts, Greg Duncan, and Hao-Nan Kwon, using a larger and far more representative sample of children, told a more complicated story. Once a child's family income and background were accounted for, the predictive power of the wait mostly disappeared. A child's ability to wait for a second marshmallow, it turned out, was tangled up with how reliable adults had generally been in that child's life so far, and how safe it actually felt to trust a stranger's promise of more later. The marshmallow was never the whole test. Trust was quietly sitting inside it the entire time. Warren Buffett had already been investing for decades by the time he turned 50, yet the overwhelming majority of his fortune was built in the years that followed, on the same ordinary annual return, compounding on a base that kept getting larger. This is simply what compounding does to wealth once enough time has passed for it to work. A modest, steady percentage return grows slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then dramatically once the base it is acting on has grown large enough for the same percentage to represent a much larger absolute amount. Most of the visible growth arrives late in the process, almost regardless of exactly when the underlying decisions to save and reinvest were originally made, which means the decisive years often look, from the outside, like nothing is happening at all. The discipline required was never one spectacular decision. It was the same small decision, repeated across years, to reinvest rather than spend, and to wait rather than act, through long stretches where the visible reward for waiting was close to nothing. 2 people who save the same modest amount, one starting a decade earlier than the other, can end up with wildly different totals despite contributing similar amounts overall, purely because one of them gave the process a decade longer to compound in silence before anyone was paying attention to it. For most of those decades, from the outside, it looked like nothing was happening at all. In laboratory experiments conducted by John Darley and Bib Latané, a person who believed they were the only witness to someone in distress nearby helped quickly and reliably. A person who believed several other witnesses were also present, hearing the exact same distress, often did not help at all. Darley and Latané, running this research in the late 1960s, called the pattern diffusion of responsibility. The more people who could plausibly act, the less any single person feels the decision rests specifically on them, and the felt weight of responsibility appears to divide across the group roughly the way a debt would, leaving each individual holding only a small, easily dismissed fraction of it. A second mechanism compounds the first. Each bystander glances at the others to judge whether the situation is actually serious, and everyone's outward calm, itself often just uncertainty in disguise, ends up reassuring everyone else that no action is needed. The effect has replicated across dozens of studies since, in settings far less dramatic than the original emergencies it was built to explain. A message left unanswered in a group chat, a task left undone in a room full of people equally capable of doing it, a decision that gets endlessly deferred because everyone quietly assumes someone else, somewhere in the group, has already decided to handle it. 30 people had exactly the same information as one. Only one of them decided it was theirs to act on. Ask someone who has kept a habit for years to describe their record, and they rarely describe perfection. They describe something closer to a single working rule. Never let one missed day become 2. Research into habit formation has found repeatedly that an occasional missed day does surprisingly little damage to a habit already underway, so long as the routine resumes shortly afterward. What actually seems to matter is the response to that first lapse, not the lapse itself. A single missed session, missed meal, or missed practice is simply a data point, one ordinary day among many easily absorbed by a pattern that has already been repeated often enough to have real momentum behind it. A second consecutive miss is a different event entirely. It begins to establish a new pattern, one built on skipping, that competes directly with the old pattern for the same slot in a person's day. Much of the damage blamed on a single lapse actually gets done afterward by the story a person tells themselves about what the lapse means. Treating one missed day as proof that the whole effort has failed tends to produce the second missed day directly, turning a minor stumble into the actual beginning of the end. A runner who misses a single morning and simply runs the next one keeps a habit. A runner who misses a morning, decides the streak is already ruined, and quietly stops checking, has usually stopped running weeks before they would ever admit it out loud. The first missed day was never the dangerous one. In a study following more than 12,000 people across more than 3 decades, researchers Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler found that a person's chances of becoming obese rose measurably when a close friend did, even when that friend lived hundreds of miles away and the two rarely saw each other in person. The study, drawing on decades of data originally collected for an unrelated heart disease project, found the same pattern was not explained by shared neighborhoods, shared food access, or any other environmental factor the researchers could control for. The behavior appeared to travel through the social network itself, passing between people who were connected but not necessarily nearby, in a way that looked less like shared circumstance and more like quiet contagion. Christakis and Fowler later found comparable patterns in the same dataset for smoking cessation and for reported happiness, suggesting the effect was not specific to any one behavior. A decision made by one person in a network, then, rarely stays contained to that person alone. It measurably nudges the odds for everyone connected to them, whether or not anyone involved is aware that any influence has passed between them at all. A person choosing to take up running or to quit a bad habit is quietly changing not only their own odds but the odds of friends they may not speak to for months, in a chain reaching further than either of them could ever trace by hand. Nobody in that network ever decided anything entirely alone. Describe an outbreak that threatens 600 lives, offer people a choice between 2 programs with mathematically identical outcomes, and change nothing except whether the outcomes are described as lives saved or lives lost, and the preferred choice reliably flips. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran this experiment in 1981 and called it the framing effect, part of the same body of work that eventually helped Kahneman win a Nobel Prize. When a program was described as saving 200 lives for certain, most people chose it over a riskier alternative. When the mathematically identical program was instead described as 400 lives being lost for certain, most people reversed their preference and chose the riskier alternative instead. Even though nothing about the actual outcomes had changed at all, only the words used to describe them. The same lever operates well outside the laboratory. A surgery described by its 90% survival rate sounds different from the identical surgery described by its 10% mortality rate, even though a patient hearing either version is being told exactly the same thing. A raise described as smaller than expected feels like a loss. The same number described as a bonus on top of an unchanged salary feels like a gain. The 600 lives never changed, only the sentence describing them did. Psychologist Elliot Aronson played recordings of an obviously capable person being interviewed, and listeners rated that person as more likable, not less, in the version where the recording ended with the person clumsily spilling a cup of coffee. Aronson ran this study in 1966 and named the result the pratfall effect. Pure competence, displayed with no visible flaw at all, appears to read as slightly cold or intimidating, a performance rather than a person. A single small, visible mistake seems to puncture just enough of that distance to make the competence underneath it feel more approachable rather than diminished by the error. The effect has a limit worth naming honestly. It reverses for people already perceived as average or below average, where the same clumsy mistake simply confirms the existing lower impression rather than humanizing anything. Most people's instinct, faced with a small mistake in front of others, is to hide it, smooth over it, or explain it away as quickly as possible. The more counterintuitive option, letting a minor flaw be seen plainly and moving on without excessive apology, often serves a person's likability better than successfully concealing the mistake ever would have. A speaker who stumbles briefly over a word mid-presentation and simply continues is often remembered as more genuine than a speaker whose delivery was flawless throughout, precisely because the small stumble is the moment the audience stopped watching a performance and started watching a person. The spilled coffee was never the thing people remembered least about him. Benjamin Franklin, by his own account, once kept a small book in which he tracked, day by day, his progress against 13 virtues he had personally chosen, working through them one at a time, 1 week at a time. The virtues included temperance, order, resolution, and a handful of others Franklin considered worth cultivating, and his method was almost mechanically simple. A small mark placed against any virtue he had failed to practice on a given day, reviewed and tallied at the end of each week. He wrote, with a candour rare for a man later remembered as a founding statesman, that he never came close to mastering most of the 13, and that the marks against his name continued appearing for years. He kept the practice anyway, arguing that a person aiming at a high standard and repeatedly falling short of it still ends up further along than a person who never wrote the standard down at all. A decision merely intended lives entirely inside a person's own head, invisible, easily reshaped by memory into something better or worse than it actually was. A decision written down and tracked, even imperfectly, becomes a small checkable fact a person has to reckon with directly. He never finished the notebook, he kept it anyway. The psychologist Kurt Lewin proposed, in the middle of the 20th century, a small equation stating that behavior is a function of the person and the environment they are standing in, not of the person alone. Lewin's field theory became foundational to social psychology precisely because it reframed a question people had long assumed had a purely personal answer. Two people with near-identical character can behave in strikingly different ways depending entirely on the specific room, situation, or set of surrounding cues they happen to occupy at a given moment, not because either person's underlying nature shifted, but because the environment itself was doing part of the deciding. Change the environment, in Lewin's framing, and the range of decisions that feel natural inside it changes along with it. A kitchen arranged one way makes reaching for a healthier snack the path of least resistance. A phone left in a different room makes sustained focus the easier decision rather than the disciplined one. A desk kept clear and well lit makes simply beginning work feel less like an act of willpower and more like the obvious next step. The decision felt personal. Some of it had already been made by the room. In a 1966 study, researchers Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser first asked homeowners to accept a small, harmless request, a tiny sign in a window, and only later asked a much larger favor, a large, unattractive sign on the front lawn. Homeowners who had agreed to the small request first said yes to the large one at a far higher rate than homeowners approached only with the large request. Friedman and Fraser called the pattern the foot in the door technique, and their proposed mechanism is quietly revealing. Agreeing to the small request appears to shift a person's own sense of who they are, at least slightly, toward being the kind of person who supports this particular cause. The larger request, arriving later, is not really being weighed on its own merits at that point. It is mostly being measured against an identity the person has, in effect, already accepted a few weeks earlier without quite realizing they had accepted anything at all. The technique is used deliberately in fundraising, sales, and persuasion generally, precisely because it works so reliably. Recognizing the shape of it, a small yes offered early, arriving well before the request that actually matters, is itself a meaningful form of protection against being led somewhere by it unnoticed. The large sign was never really the request being agreed to, it was the small one, weeks earlier. Ask two people to intend to vote, exercise, or get a medical screening, but ask one of them to also write down the specific time, place, and exact steps they will take, and the second person follows through at meaningfully higher rates. The psychologist Peter Gollwitzer and his collaborators have documented this pattern across a wide range of behaviors under the name implementation intentions. A vague intention, however sincere, leaves the actual moment of decision wide open when it eventually arrives, exposed to whatever competing pressure, distraction, or simple tiredness happens to be present at the time. A specific plan made in advance closes most of that opening before it can ever be exploited. By the time the moment described in the plan actually arrives, there is very little left to decide. The plan has already made the decision. The person is simply carrying out something already agreed to. The effect has been found across studies on turnout, on gym attendance, and on medical screening rates, in each case with the same basic shape. Naming the exact time and place a small action will happen makes that action noticeably more likely than simply meaning to do it eventually. The plan had done the deciding long before the moment it described ever arrived. Researchers studying littering behavior have found something a printed sign rarely achieves on its own. A person is measurably more likely to litter in a space that already looks littered, and measurably less likely to in a space that looks clean, regardless of any rule posted nearby. The explanation researchers favor involves what is sometimes called a descriptive norm. The existing physical state of a space seems to communicate, wordlessly and far more effectively than any posted instruction, what people apparently already consider acceptable there. A single piece of litter left on otherwise clean ground does not read as a rule broken. It reads as evidence about what everyone else has quietly decided is normal in that particular place, and the next person to pass through tends to align with that evidence, rather than with the sign standing a few feet away from it. The same quiet signaling runs through workplaces, shared kitchens, and online spaces of every kind. The first small decision made in a space, tidy or careless, generous or curt, sets an invisible standard that every subsequent decision in that same space tends to measure itself against, whether or not anyone involved ever states the standard out loud. The first piece of litter was never really litter. It was an instruction. The writer and scholar Umberto Eco kept a personal library of some 30,000 books, and once explained that visitors always asked the wrong question about it. They assumed the value of the collection was in how many of the books he had actually read. Eco's own answer, later picked up and extended by the writer Nassim Taleb, treats an unread library as a research instrument rather than a trophy shelf, a standing physical reminder of the sheer size of what remains unknown, deliberately kept close so that certainty never gets too comfortable. Most people build the opposite kind of collection without quite intending to, surrounding themselves mainly with books, opinions, and sources that confirm positions they already hold, quietly narrowing the range of what still feels genuinely open to question. The same discipline applies well beyond books. Deliberately keeping a few questions unresolved, a few positions undefended, a few disagreements unsettled, resists the pull toward a tidy, closed worldview that feels finished, but has simply stopped growing. A shelf of books someone has already read confirms who they already are. A shelf of books someone has not yet gotten to, chosen with the same care, quietly points toward who they might still become. The unread books were never a failure to finish. They were the point. In chemistry, almost no reaction simply happens on its own the moment the ingredients are combined. Nearly everyone requires a first burst of energy, called activation energy, before it can release far more energy than that first push ever cost. A match will not light itself sitting quietly in its box, no matter how much energy is stored inside the chemicals coating its tip, until the friction of striking supplies the small initial push needed to start the reaction. Once that threshold is crossed, the reaction becomes self-sustaining, releasing far more heat than the strike itself required. The same shape, borrowed loosely rather than literally, describes something true about an ordinary unwanted task. The first minute of it, the getting started, the standing up, the opening of the file, tends to cost disproportionately more than any of the minutes that follow once the task is genuinely underway. A great deal of procrastination is not really an aversion to the task itself, examined honestly. It is an aversion to that one costly, disproportionate first push, avoided over and over in favor of a present moment that asks nothing at all. Once a person is 10 minutes into the unpleasant task, the whole calculation that made avoiding it feel sensible a moment earlier has usually already stopped applying, replaced by ordinary momentum that asks for surprisingly little further effort to sustain. Nothing about the task changed once it was underway, only the cost of starting it had already been paid. Researchers studying habit formation consistently find that changing the physical path between a person and an action, removing one extra step, placing an object where it will be seen, measurably changes how often that action gets done, often more than any change in motivation does. The logic is almost embarrassingly simple once it is stated plainly. A decision that requires locating equipment, changing clothes, and traveling somewhere is competing every single evening against a decision that requires only picking up a bag already sitting by the door. On a tired, ordinary evening, with motivation running low for both options, the difference in friction between them, not the difference in how much either option is wanted, usually decides which one wins. Willpower gets credited with the outcome either way, but willpower was rarely the variable actually doing the work. The same principle runs in the opposite direction just as reliably. Adding one extra step between a person and an unwanted habit, moving the snack out of easy reach, logging out of an app that has to be logged back into, quietly lowers how often that habit gets chosen, without requiring a single additional ounce of resolve. The bag by the door had already made half the decision before the evening even arrived. In his research on marriage, John Gottman found something that mattered more to whether a relationship survived than how often couples argued at all. Whether one partner's small attempt to de-escalate a fight got accepted or waved away by the other. Gottman called these small gestures repair attempts, a joke offered mid-conflict, a hand reached for, a simple acknowledgement that the argument has gone further than either person wanted it to. What his research found, somewhat counterintuitively, is that the skill of the repair attempt itself mattered far less than how it was received. A clumsy, awkwardly timed repair attempt, accepted, still de-escalated the fight. A well-crafted one, waved away or ignored, did nothing at all. Couples in stable, lasting relationships accepted repair attempts readily, almost regardless of how gracefully they were offered. Couples heading toward separation, in the same research, often rejected even the well-made ones. The decision to accept an offered olive branch, however small or however awkwardly it arrives, tends to matter more to the outcome of a disagreement than which side happened to be right about the original argument in the first place. The apology was rarely the hard part. The acceptance of it was. Researchers Nalini Ambadi and Robert Rosenthal showed observers silent video clips of teachers, each only a few seconds long, with no sound and no context, and the ratings those observers gave lined up closely with full semester evaluations from the teacher's own students. Ambadi and Rosenthal ran this study in 1992 and called the underlying skill thin slicing, the mind's capacity to extract a surprisingly accurate judgment from a very small amount of behavioral information, posture, expression, the set of a person's shoulders, well before any conscious deliberation has had time to begin. The finding unsettled a comfortable assumption that fair judgment requires long acquaintance. A great deal of judgment, it turns out, happens automatically and near instantly, and the deliberation that follows it mostly rationalizes a conclusion the mind had already reached. Job interviews, first dates, and negotiations all carry this same quiet asymmetry. An hour of careful conversation feels, to the people having it, like the moment the decision is genuinely being made. Often, a meaningful part of that decision was already settled in its opening seconds, and the rest of the hour was mostly spent confirming it. The hour of conversation that followed was mostly confirming a decision the first few seconds had already made. Psychologists who study procrastination describe it as something more specific than poor time management. They describe it as a decision, made and quietly remade every single day, to trade a larger cost later for a smaller relief right now. The errand itself rarely grows objectively harder while it waits. A phone call postponed for 2 years is, mechanically, still just a phone call. What changes, day after day, is the ease of the decision to avoid it again. Each time avoidance is chosen, it becomes slightly more automatic, requiring slightly less conscious thought than the time before, until the daily choice barely registers as a choice at all. At some point, the task stops living on a person's actual to-do list and starts living somewhere closer to their sense of who they are. A person who has, for reasons no longer examined, simply not made that call. The relief brought by avoidance each day is small and real, which is precisely why the pattern is so durable. Nobody chooses 2 years of delay in a single decision. They choose one ordinary day of relief, roughly 700 times in a row. The strange comfort in this is that undoing it works the same way in reverse. The decision to finally make the call does not require undoing 2 years of avoidance at once, only choosing, once on one ordinary day, differently than the day before it. The errand had not grown harder. Only the habit of avoiding it had grown easier. A common technique for building a new habit asks a person to shrink whatever they are trying to start until the very first version of it takes no longer than 2 minutes. Not a workout, just putting on running shoes. Not a book, just opening it to the first page. The 2 minutes accomplish almost nothing on their own, and that is not a flaw in the technique, it is the entire point of it. The decision actually being avoided was never the workout or the reading itself. It was starting at all from a completely stationary position, which is reliably the single hardest moment in the entire sequence. A person, standing with running shoes already laced, is facing a much smaller decision than a person still deciding whether to change clothes in the first place, and continuing from that point, it turns out, requires far less resolve than beginning ever did. Most abandoned plans, looked at honestly, never really fail partway through. They fail at the threshold, in the gap between intending to begin and actually beginning, a gap the 2-minute version is built specifically to close. Shrinking a goal down this far can feel almost dishonest, as though the person is tricking themselves out of the real ambition behind it, but the ambition was never in danger. Only the starting was, and starting is exactly what 2 minutes is designed to make unremarkable. Nearly every abandoned plan died at its threshold, not partway through it. The psychologist Shelley Gable found something unexpected in her research on couples. How a partner responded to good news, with real interest or with a distracted shrug, predicted the health of the relationship even more strongly than how partners responded to bad news. Most relationship advice focuses on conflict, on how to argue well and recover afterward, and Gable's research, published in the early 2000s, did not dispute the importance of that. It simply pointed to a smaller, easier-to-miss moment sitting right next to it. Whether a person looked up from what they were doing when their partner shared something good. Gable called a warm, curious, engaged response to good news active constructive responding, and found it in surprisingly short supply, even among couples who considered their relationships happy overall. A distracted acknowledgement, a quick well done without a single follow-up question, cost almost nothing to notice in the moment and cost quite a lot over the course of a relationship. A decision made in the space of a single sentence, to look up or to keep scrolling, rarely feels like it is deciding anything. Repeated often enough, it quietly becomes the difference between a partner who feels celebrated and one who has simply learned to stop sharing. The bad news had never been the real test. The good news, quietly, always was. Neuroscientist Anne Graybiel and her colleagues found that once a behavior becomes a deeply practiced habit, brain activity actually shifts, concentrating at the very start and the very end of the action, and dropping away almost entirely in the middle, as though the behavior is now running on its own. Graybiel's research, based largely on studies of the basal ganglia, describes this as a kind of packaging. A long sequence of small decisions gets compressed over time into a single automatic unit, triggered by one cue and carried out to completion with very little ongoing input from the parts of the brain responsible for conscious deliberation. This packaging is what makes habits so efficient, and it is also exactly what makes them so hard to notice, let alone reconsider. A habit does not check, each time it runs, whether its original reason is still valid. It simply runs on cue, the same way it always has, long after the reason that first justified it may have quietly stopped applying at all. Noticing that a decision has become a groove rather than a live choice is itself a small decision, easy to skip and easy to keep skipping, precisely because the groove was never designed to draw attention to itself. Laying down a different groove rarely means fighting the old one directly. It usually means quietly attaching a new automatic response to the same old cue and letting repetition do, in the new direction, the same patient work it once did in the old one. The brain had stopped asking why a long time before the body stopped doing it. Economists have a name for the value of the option a person did not choose, whether or not they ever consciously thought about it. Opportunity cost. It exists in every decision, whether anyone bothers to notice it or not. A purchase leaves a receipt, a visible line item that shows up later and can be reviewed, regretted, or defended. The alternative not taken, the vacation not booked, the money saved instead of spent, the conversation postponed rather than had, leaves nothing behind at all. It simply fails to happen, silently, and because it produces no record, it rarely gets weighed with the same seriousness as the choice that was actually made. Most decisions, examined honestly, never surface their own opportunity cost in the moment they are being made. It only becomes visible much later, if at all, when the foregone alternative can no longer be recovered on any terms. Naming the alternative being given up, plainly and in advance, before a decision rather than after it, tends to change which option actually gets chosen, simply by making a cost visible that would otherwise have passed by unmeasured and unmourned. The vacation not taken left no receipt, which is exactly why it was so easy to forget it had ever been a choice at all. The philosopher and psychologist William James wrote, in 1890, that a person is little more than a bundle of habits, and that a sense of self is built largely from the accumulated record of past decisions, rather than from any fixed inner character. James' framing, laid out in his Principles of Psychology, carries an implication that is easy to state and genuinely difficult to sit with. Every choice functions as a small vote for the kind of person someone is becoming, whether or not the person casting it is paying any attention at all. Modern research on identity-based habits has arrived at a compatible conclusion from a different direction, finding that habits stick more reliably when a person frames the behavior as part of who they already are, rather than as an external rule imposed on them from outside. Someone who has decided they are a person who reads, in this framing, is choosing something quite different from someone merely trying to read more. Nobody else is keeping a tally of these small private votes. There is no external ledger, no visible audience, no scoreboard updating in real time. Nobody else was keeping that ledger. It was being kept anyway. The Roman Empire built a network of main roads, roughly 80,000 kilometers long, engineered layer by layer, stone fitted to stone by crews who worked one short stretch at a time, and rarely saw more than a small piece of the whole project. The construction itself was almost defiantly unglamorous. Layers of sand, gravel and fitted paving stone, built to shed water and bear weight, repeated for mile after mile by labourers whose names were never recorded, and who, in most cases, worked only a short section of road within sight of their own camp. None of them stood on a hill and watched an empire connect itself. They dug, levelled and set stone, one stretch at a time, on an ordinary morning that looked like every other morning, and some of what they built is still holding weight more than 2,000 years later. A river cuts a canyon the same way, and a marriage runs on a ratio nobody consciously tallies the same way, and a fortune compounds quietly for decades the same way, and a person becomes who they are becoming the same way. Not through the one large decision remembered clearly enough to tell at dinner, but through the layer laid down again, ordinarily, on a Tuesday nobody thought was worth writing down. No single crew ever saw the empire they were quietly building underneath. The river is still running under the canyon it eventually cut, the same as it always has, carrying grains of sediment too small to see, one at a time. It has never once needed a single dramatic flood to keep shaping the ground beneath it. 45 decisions have passed since the beginning of this list, and every one of them looked, in the moment it was made, exactly like nothing. A mug held onto a little too tightly. A doorway walked through without thinking. A ratio of kind words to sharp ones, kept or lost, inside a marriage neither partner was consciously tracking. A road laid down, stone, by workers who never saw the empire their work would end up carrying. None of it demanded to be noticed, and most of it never will be, and that has turned out to be exactly how a life gets built. Not by the handful of decisions large enough to remember making, the ones that come with a date attached and a story told at dinner for years afterward, but by the thousands of others that came before and after them, indistinguishable from every ordinary day they happened to fall on. A person does not decide, once, to become someone. A person decides, again and again, in rooms nobody else is watching, in the half-second before a reply, in the 2 minutes it takes to simply begin, and the sum of all of it eventually arrives somewhere, the way a river arrives at a canyon it was never trying to carve. Nothing here asks to be acted on today. The small decisions were always going to keep arriving, the way they always have, one at a time, mostly unannounced. Whatever gets decided next, in whichever room comes next, some of it will still be here, quietly compounding, long after this particular hour has ended, and the next ordinary day has already begun.